August 31st, 1944. East of the Meuse. Patton's Third Army has just done what armies dream of doing and what logisticians fear most. It has outrun the enemy, outrun the maps, outrun the old schedules, and now, in the gray light of morning, it has outrun its own gasoline. The tanks are there. The roads are open. The road to Lorraine is in front of them. And yet the engines are silent. At Supreme Headquarters and at Bradley's level above the Army, the planning maps still look clean. The arrows still move forward. But down at the front, men are standing beside stalled vehicles, watching one of the fastest advances in modern war come to a stop, not because the Germans have held it, but because the fuel has not arrived. Before we go 1 mile farther, subscribe to WW2 Warmind, like the video, and comment below with the Wii Commander story you want next, because this one is not just about Patton. It is about Eisenhower, Bradley, Montgomery, the Red Ball Express, and the hidden war of gallons, truck routes, and decisions that changed the pace of the campaign in Europe. Patton looks at the map and sees what everyone else sees. Verdun is behind him. The Meuse has been crossed. Lorraine lies ahead. Metz lies ahead. Nancy lies ahead. The German frontier does not look impossibly far away. What looks impossible is the figure now attached to his army's future. On the 31st of August, according to the U.S. Army's own official history, Third Army receives no gasoline at all. And from the quartermaster record comes the number that turns this from inconvenience into crisis. Patton's daily allotment falls from roughly 400,000 gallons to 31,000. 31,000. For an army that has been racing across France. For an army built around momentum. For an army commanded by George S. Patton. At Third Army headquarters, the tone changes at once. Where is the fuel? Patton demands. A staff officer answers carefully. Sir, priority has gone north. How much have we got? Not enough for sustained movement, General. Not enough is not a figure. Sir, the daily allotment has fallen sharply. Patton stares at him. Sharply? Yes, sir, and when the number is finally laid out, the arithmetic becomes the real enemy. 400,000 down to 31,000. More than a 90% collapse. Enough to keep some vehicles moving for local necessity. Not enough to keep an offensive army driving east. Not enough for the kind of campaign Patton thinks he is in. Not enough for what his forward corps commanders are already trying to do. Bradley understands the problem at once, because this is now bigger than Patton's anger. At 12th Army Group, he has the broader picture. He knows the Allied advance has exploded beyond the original supply assumptions. He knows the armies have stretched their communications hundreds of miles beyond the Normandy beaches. He knows this is not one army's problem. It is a theater problem. And yet he also knows that if Patton stops here, something important changes in the whole campaign. Bradley studies the map. He checks the distances. The numbers do not lie. On paper, he says quietly, they've got the road. In practice, they haven't got the gasoline. A staff officer nods. Yes, sir. How long can he keep spearheads active? Not long. How long before he's static? Another pause. In effect, sir, he already is. That is the impossible fact at the center of this story. The fastest army in France is now trapped by mathematics, not by a German fortress, not by a river line, by supply allocation. For the next 5 days, the official history says, Third Army is virtually immobilized. During that period, it receives about 1/4 of the gasoline it actually requires. And the reason is brutally clear. Eisenhower has given logistical priority to the British and American forces farther north, toward Antwerp and the Ruhr. That choice is strategic. It is rational. It is defensible. But to Patton, it feels like strangulation. And the most dangerous part is this. The Germans do not need to win a battle here. They only need time. That is the first revelation. The second is even more dramatic, because Patton does not intend to sit still and accept the word static, and the official record says that what happened next included gasoline captured from the Germans, gasoline received by air, and gasoline hijacked from First Army depots. On September 2nd, 1944, near Granville, Eisenhower summons his senior commanders. Bradley is there. Patton is there. Hodges is there. Vandenberg is there. This is not a casual talk. This is the moment when coalition strategy confronts battlefield momentum face to face. Eisenhower is calm, composed, carrying the burden of the whole front. He is not thinking only about Patton. He is thinking about Antwerp, the Ruhr, the Northern Axis, Montgomery's demands, the shape of the Allied front, the ports, the depots, the truck columns, and the fact that no commander in France gets to outrun the tonnage. He begins without drama. Gentlemen, the supply situation governs operations. Nobody interrupts. We do not yet possess the logistical support to sustain every opportunity at once. The principal offensive weight must remain in the northeast. Patton's face is hard, unreadable. Eisenhower continues. Until sufficient gasoline and other supplies have accumulated, First Army and Third Army will remain generally static. There it is. Not a flourish. Not a rebuke. A sentence cold enough to stop an army. Patton leans forward. Static, sir? Generally static. My army did not come this far to sit on a riverbank. This is not a matter of preference, George. It is a matter of tonnage. My men can eat their belts, Patton says, the frustration finally breaking into the room, but my tanks gotta have gas. Nobody needs that translated. Bradley says nothing for a moment. He knows both men are right in their own way. Patton is right about tempo. Eisenhower is right about the theater. But only one of them is commanding all Allied ground operations. Eisenhower's voice stays level. I know your position. I also know the position of every other army on this front. Patton replies instantly. And mine is the one with the open road. The northern advance has priority. For now, Patton says. For now, Eisenhower answers, and the meeting moves on. That is the confrontation people expect to end with a dramatic permission slip or a secret wink. It does not. Patton does not win the meeting. Eisenhower does not indulge him. The record gives us something more interesting than that. It gives us the exact fault line in Allied command. One man thinks in terms of momentum, the other thinks in terms of coalition war. And that is why the story becomes far more dangerous after the meeting, not less. Because an order to remain generally static sounds clear at headquarters. At the front, it sounds like death to opportunity. Third Army feels the pause almost at once. Men who have lived in motion now live in waiting. Crews sit on armored vehicles and stare east. Drivers nurse half-empty tanks. Corps staffs try to prioritize what little fuel remains. Reconnaissance can still probe, but the great sweeping movement is gone. The army that had crossed France like a storm now feels its own weight settling into the roads and fields of Lorraine, and with every hour, the Germans recover something priceless. Time. That is the part often missed in popular memory. The pause is not merely embarrassing, it is strategically expensive. The official history is blunt. When gasoline receipts finally increased enough for the advance to resume, the opportunity of sweeping through Lorraine unopposed had passed. That line should stop any serious student of the campaign in his tracks. Not because it makes Eisenhower a villain, it does not, but because it reveals how thin the margin was between collapse and recovery on the German side, and how much operational tempo depended on fuel rather than fire. At Bradley's level, the issue now becomes command friction. A staff officer says, Montgomery is still arguing for concentration in the north. Bradley exhales. He would. And General Patton, sir? He is not a man built for stillness. Do you believe he'll hold where he is? Bradley looks down at the map and answers like a man who knows George Patton too well. He'll hold as much as he is forced to hold. But if he finds a way to move, he'll move. That is exactly what makes this story feel like war-decoded material. It is not merely Patton versus Germany. It is Patton versus the administrative reality of a coalition offensive. It is also a story in which the most important men are suddenly not always generals. They are truck drivers, mechanics, quartermaster officers, traffic controllers, men on bad roads pushing gasoline forward in 5-gallon cans, tank trucks, and improvised distribution chains. Look at the numbers. The Red Ball Express had been created on August 25th as an emergency answer to the runaway success of the breakout from Normandy. Within days, nearly 6,000 vehicles were operating. On August 29th, those truck companies delivered more than 12,000 tons of supplies in a single day, a record performance. By September 5th, the system had delivered 89,000 tons to forward areas. In the first month alone, the operation moved 290,000 tons of supplies, and at peak strength, about 75% of the drivers were African American soldiers whose work kept armies alive while other men received the glory. At one truck halt, a driver wipes dust from his face and says to another, "If they want it up there, we'll take it up there." Another man answers, "If the truck holds, we make it hold." That is not ornament. That is the hidden machinery of victory. Back in Patton's world, the language is more direct. How much can we scrape together? A logistics officer answers, "Some from emergency dumps, some from local redistribution, some from captured stocks, if they're intact." Patton snaps back, "If it burns, I want it. Yes, sir. And if some depot has more than it needs while my tanks stand idle." The officer hesitates. Patton finishes the thought for him. Then someone had better develop initiative. Now, to be careful with the history, the best documented phrasing comes from the official overview, not from a verbatim conversation in Patton's diary. It says Patton's troops captured some gasoline from the Germans, hijacked some from First Army depots, and received some by air. That is enough. That is more than enough, because it tells us the real shape of the crisis. This was no ordinary shortage. This was an army improvising fuel by every method available, and that is where the story takes on its strangest quality. The Allied advance in late August and early September 1944 becomes, in part, a competition not of divisions but of pipelines, depots, port capacity, and truck miles. The maps still show arrows, but the real contest is over gallons. 2 or 3 minutes into any ordinary military story, the audience expects tanks and gunfire. Here, the decisive instrument is a fuel column, and that creates the next revelation. The Germans are watching too. They may not understand every Allied supply decision, but they understand the result. The pressure that had been relentless is no longer relentless. The pace slows. The breathless pursuit loses some of its breath. Space appears where there had been none. That breathing space allows German units in Lorraine to reform, dig in, and make the coming campaign more costly than it might otherwise have been. A German staff officer does not need to say much. He only needs to note that the Americans are no longer arriving at yesterday's speed. At Supreme Headquarters, Eisenhower's staff still works through the larger problem. Antwerp remains crucial. The northeastern route remains crucial. The broad front concept remains the governing logic. This is where later critics often simplify the story into a petty quarrel between commanders. It was much more than that. Eisenhower is not choosing between men. He is choosing between strategic priorities in an environment where the entire Allied system is stretched beyond its planned limits. Still, to the men at the front, strategic logic arrives as silence in the engine compartment. By the first week of September, the pressure on the supply network begins to ease. Forward truckheads are once again issuing petroleum as soon as it comes in. Consumption begins to climb back toward the brutal figures required by mechanized war. By mid-September, the two American armies are issuing more than 1 million gallons of gasoline daily. That is the recovery. That is the machine finally catching up with the dash across France. But before that recovery arrives, the mystery remains. How did Patton keep the army alive at all? Part of the answer lies in the Red Ball Express, part lies in captured German fuel, part lies in air delivery, and part lies in that extraordinary official phrase, hijacked from First Army depots. It is the kind of line that instantly reveals character without needing embellishment. It tells you what Patton's world looked like. It tells you what his subordinates thought urgency justified. It tells you that in the space between formal allocation and battlefield necessity, men were making hard decisions in real time. Bradley hears reports and understands exactly what sort of commander he has beneath him. "He's still finding gasoline," a staff officer says. "Of course he is," Bradley replies. "Do you want me to stop it, sir?" Bradley pauses. "I want the front to hold together. I want the theater commander obeyed, and I want no foolishness that creates a larger problem than the one we've already got." But General Patton, Bradley gives him a thin look. "I am aware of General Patton. Now the story approaches its true center, the part the title promises. What did Eisenhower say when Patton kept pushing movement against a supply policy that had effectively cut his legs out from under him? The answer is not theatrical. That is why it works. It is September 2nd again. Return to the meeting. Return to the room. Return to the two men who see the same war from different altitudes. Eisenhower's line is the title line. It is the archival answer. First Army and Third Army will remain generally static until sufficient gasoline and supplies have accumulated. That is what he said. And what makes it unforgettable is what stands against it. Patton's answer. Patton's whole philosophy of command compressed into one sentence. My men can eat their belts, but my tanks gotta have gas. There is the quote. There is the collision. There is the meaning. One line says war is a system. The other says war is movement. One line belongs to a supreme commander balancing national armies, ports, frontages, reserves, and the road to the Ruhr. The other belongs to a field commander who sees an enemy reeling and cannot bear to let him recover. And in that exchange, you hear the whole argument of the Western Front in September 1944. Not broad front versus narrow thrust as an abstraction, not Patton versus Montgomery as gossip, but coalition mathematics against battlefield instinct. Once you understand that, the rest of the episode becomes clear. Eisenhower did not bless fuel theft. He did not turn to Patton and say, go take whatever you can find. The historical record does not support that. What it supports is something more disciplined and, in its way, more dramatic. Eisenhower held to the strategic necessity. Patton strained against it, and between them, the actual army improvised as best it could until the supply structure recovered. That is why this story matters. It is not about whether Patton was right in every complaint. It is about what kind of war the Allies were now fighting. They had advanced so far, so quickly, that victory itself had generated crisis. Now the aftermath. Third Army's pause in late August and early September did not end the campaign. Patton would fight on through Lorraine, through Metz, through the autumn mud, and later into the winter battles that made his name even larger. But the moment of free exploitation, the dream of simply racing through a collapsing enemy, was gone. The official history says so with painful clarity. By the time the gasoline arrived in sufficient quantities, the chance to sweep through Lorraine unopposed had passed. Remember the numbers because they tell the story better than adjectives ever could. From 400,000 gallons to 31,000. 5 days virtually immobilized. Nearly 6,000 Red Ball vehicles. 12,342 tons delivered on the record day of August 29th. 89,000 tons delivered by September 5th. More than 1 million gallons being issued daily to the two American armies by mid-September. Those figures are not background. They are the battlefield. And when you think of the faces behind them, do not think only of the generals. Think also of the Red Ball drivers moving day and night, repairing trucks on the roadside, pushing fuel forward because without that work the advance across France would have ended in dust, idling engines, and lost opportunity. Years later, even Eisenhower would honor that truth. In an October 1944 message, he called the Red Ball line the lifeline between combat and supply. That may be the best final authority quote for this entire episode, because it explains retrospectively what everybody learned in those anxious days at the end of August and the beginning of September. The lifeline was not metaphorical. It was literal. If it held, the armies moved. If it failed, the war slowed. So when people ask what Eisenhower said when Patton was starved of fuel after priority went north, the answer is this. He said the armies would remain generally static until the supplies had accumulated. Cold words. Necessary words. Strategic words. And Patton answered with the fury of a commander who believed speed was itself a weapon. Between those two sentences lies one of the purest command dramas of the war, and between those two men stood everyone else. Bradley with his operational balance, the quartermasters with their impossible arithmetic, the truck drivers with their convoys, the mechanics keeping worn-out vehicles alive, the staff officers trying to convert plans into tonnage, the frontline crews waiting beside silent armor for one more shipment of gasoline. That is the hidden truth of this moment. Germany did not stop Patton at the end of August 1944. Logistics did, and for a few critical days, Allied victory depended not on who could fire farther or maneuver faster, but on who could move enough fuel far enough, fast enough, to keep the engines alive. If you want more untold We Command stories, told with documents, maps, and the real voices of the men who made the decisions, subscribe to WW2 Warmind, like the video, and comment below with the next story you want us to decode.